A or 1B or a combination of 1A and 1B when you look at all of the, if you're familiar with the manual uniform traffic control devices, there are different thresholds, and I don't mean to get too technical, but they're similar to wastewater and drainage. There are certain ways to do certain things, and we looked at the manual on uniform traffic control devices to see if a signal was warranted, and it didn't meet the warrants for 1A or 1B, and then they allow you to take a combination where you take 80% of 1 and 80% of 1B, but they both have to be met for that. So I looked at it that way, and according to my calculations, that did not meet. And this is after relooking at a couple of cells that didn't get copied right, but I redone that. I think that was acceptable. And then I looked at the 4-hour warrant, and the 4-hour warrant, based on the fixed cells in the spreadsheet, it was met. It was met for the 4-hour warrant, where if you plot the 2-hour on one volume against the higher volume on the other, and it falls above that curve that's printed in the manual, and if it's over for 4 hours, then you meet the minimum warrant for that. And we did meet that. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to put signals in. It says that you can put signals in if everything else is considered. And I'm going to let your consultant, the town, and everybody else talk about it, but I've been playing in traffic. I like it, put it that way. My dad told me to play in traffic. I've been in the traffic engineer field since 1971. And the one that I can recall that once you put signals in and they cause all kinds of havoc. I worked in the red line extension for United Engineers. That was back in '67. And by the time I got to Quincy, they had taken the traffic signals out of the intersection of Beale Street and Old Colony. And initially they were in that, but the traffic backed up between Old Colony and Newport Ave. And I don't know if you're familiar with the area, but the Wollaston Station, it's right there. You'll see one of them that's on flash all the time. You know, why don't they ever put that on stop and go? Well, the reason they don't is it created havoc. There was no way they could operate all of that. And it was easier not to entice traffic to come out Old Colony from Hancock Street, but to force it to go away and come a different way so that you didn't have that problem. So I'm going to pick up on that a little bit. If you put a traffic signal in, where right now you have traffic backed up on Central Avenue from Elliott Street all the way back to River Street every day for 2 hours during the evening peak hour. It doesn't go that in the morning peak hour, you know, because it's going the other way. But evening peak hour, you have a bad traffic jam from Elliott all the way back to River Street, and it's every day. If you put signals in, you're supposed to time them to proportional traffic volumes. And that is the highest volume leg during the evening peak hours coming across the bridge. If you time it that way, there is a very good chance that you're going to entice traffic to cut through Milton that's not cutting through now. Now it's too much of a problem for them. They'll go some other way. But if you keep giving them the green light there, they may decide to take it. Moreover, if you do your signals at Central Avenue and Elliott, now you're going to have to put a pedestrian phase in. I've watched the cars. I did the cars myself, so I've watched them yield to the pedestrians in the crosswalk. I've watched the cars park and unpark. I've watched all of this for a long time. If you have a ped phase come in, every time someone crosses the street, there's going to be a lot of dead time. Right now, they stop, the pedestrian crosses, then they go. But if you have to clear out one of the others with the 3 seconds yellow and then the 2 seconds all red, then you give them 7 seconds of walk, then you give them about 20 seconds of flash and don't walk, and then you read that out before you turn it back on. Now you know you've got a lot of dead time. Now you've got traffic backing up on each of the legs. I'm not trying to tell you tonight not to do it. I'm just telling you these are things that you should consider as you're making your decision. What you do is on the Central Avenue, you've got that MBTA light transit rail that's going over just beside the bridge. Right now, the traffic that does back up the river, it stops. It usually does not get on that track. If they've had a green light and they've been waiting for a green light after they've had the red, you don't know where they're going to stop because they're used to going and they don't like to stop going. You may have that problem. Moreover, you can put what we call the Q detector, a wire underneath the roadway just on the Elliott side of on Central Avenue, but right away from the track. So if traffic does back up that far, it'll sense the presence of a car. It'll turn Central Avenue green, and then it'll pull that through so the traffic won't back up across the track. Well, that does cost a little bit more than we're talking about equipment and bells and whistles and all of that. But it does solve the problem a little bit. But what it doesn't do is, because you are really making that better for Central Avenue every time you do that, you're making it worse on the other legs, and now you're further encouraging people to use Central Avenue as a way to come across, because you're giving them more green time. I'm just saying these are the things you'd have to consider. I know it meets the 4-hour warrant, and Jen does too. I've never used a 4-hour warrant to justify putting in traffic signals, but I have used it to look closer. And I am not waiting for somebody to get killed. That's what they'll say when I say my next statement, and that is you have a lower crash history out there than I thought you did. And if you had a higher crash history, especially if it was cross collisions, I'd agree with you, by all means, put the signals in, get rid of those cross collisions, because they are more dangerous. You have more personal injury. If you put a signal in where you don't have an awful lot, you're going to have someone that's decided to stop at a yellow light because they think they should. Either they're just going to cruise back around the corner, they stop at the yellow light, or someone else didn't think they were going to stop, or it was complete, like the chief would say, inattention. He wasn't paying attention to the car in front of him. It's not the signal that causes the accident, and I didn't mean to infer that. What I meant was, if you do put signals in and your rate is down, that may go up with the rear end, but that's the rear end type accidents, but they are less of a problem than the cross collisions that you try to get rid of. And I was kind of surprised that there weren't more cross collisions out there. And before I go on and on and on, I don't know whether you'd like to hear from your own consultant, but I think she agreed with me a little bit.
She seemed to be nodding her head. I'm looking out of the corner of my eye. This may be
I haven't been, I was afraid to.
This may be a stupid question, but on the ped cycle issue, could you just not have a ped cycle? Could you just disable it or whatever you do and not have a light that has a ped cycle?
Well, the trouble is, if you don't do a ped cycle where you have a lot of pedestrians crossing, well, let's do it this way. You can have a ped cycle and not have an exclusive, so that when Elliott Street has a green light, you cross on your sidewalk parallel to Elliott Street. That way there, the turning movement has to watch for you, but the through movement does not have to. Ordinarily, I might say that I've used that in Quincy. They use it in Boston a lot. At this particular intersection, if you look at the turning movements, you're going to see that there are a lot of trims as cars come over the Central Avenue bridge. A lot of them will turn left on the Elliott Street, and that's when you may have a conflict that pedestrian doesn't expect. So, I mean, I'm not trying to design it, but I'm just trying to give you a shoot from the hip answer.
That's fine. I appreciate the answer. Jennifer, do you want to comment?
Sure, just fairly from the peer review, taking a look at what was provided to me. I see my memo is very brief. When I first received the memorandum that was dated October 28th, there were a few problems with the numbers. And I was just concerned about that because the conclusion was no traffic signal was warranted. And I noticed a few issues with the spreadsheet. Jack corrected those and sent me the original 2 counter data so that I could check everything from the beginning and just verify it. Everything was as he presented in his revised memorandum November 5th. No 8-hour warrants were met. They, one of them I think was close. I think it met it for 7 hours, but the threshold is it has to meet these minimum traffic volumes for 8 hours, and it didn't, and it wasn't even quite borderline, I don't think, for that 8th hour. The 4-hour warrant was met. Similar, I don't find that it is usual, in my experience, at least in Massachusetts, that the 4-hour warrant is considered the threshold to put in a traffic signal, but it is one of the warrants, so it's certainly possible. So I think
Can you just tell us in sort of layman's terms, what does the 4-hour warrant mean?
4-hour warrant means there is a certain curve that's been determined that you plot out for your main street, you have this volume, and for side street, you have this volume where those 2 points meet. If it's above the curve, the warrant is met. If it's below the curve, oh, sorry. If it's below the curve, then the warrant is not met. And it needs to be above the curve for 4 of the hours.
One of the things that you have to understand is these warrants with the threshold volumes are not just for Milton, Massachusetts. They're nationwide. And there are a lot of Midwest states, there are a lot of smaller states that they don't have the constant volumes like you have at Elliott and Central Avenue. They may be 3 or 4 hours that, that have a higher slug of traffic during your morning peak hour and your evening peak hour, but during the rest of the day, it's not so bad. Well, the people that drive in those areas, they're not used to the volumes that you see every hour. And that's when, for them, it becomes a problem. And that's probably why they have the 4-hour warrant. They have the 1-hour warrant that hardly anybody uses. That's more like a factory. Or all of a sudden there's dumps. We don't have very many factories anymore in the United States, I guess. But if all that traffic dumps out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon onto a roadway that didn't have very much traffic at all, you have to take care of that. It's either have a police chief out there or one of the, a police officer, or you put the signals in for that 1 hour. But very seldom is that ever used. The 4-hour is more like you've got an unbuilt-up area, and then you have a slug of traffic during a couple hours in the morning and a couple hours in the afternoon. And you really want to take care of that unusual condition for that land use. And that's where the 4-hour warrant is more often used, something like that. Not so much in the urban area.
Not in an urban setting. Okay.
If I may, the other question that was raised, I think more by the audience, was the question of whether the traffic projections that were used previously were accurate. And as is outlined in Mr. Gillen's memo, and I did verify as well, those turning movement counts, well, for one of the peaks were almost spot on, but for the other peak were highly conservative. So although I think there was a concern that those 2016, I think there were projections that were previously created and, modified and used in this analysis were not high enough. Well, they certainly were. He has since revised, those calculations anyway, but just to answer that question that was raised at the last meeting. And as far as just to weigh in, one of the unintended consequences when you install a traffic signal is where your stop lines are going to be, where the equipment's going to go, what modifications need to happen, and what needs to happen once you're stopping this traffic for 30 or 40 seconds while that one approach is red, and how far back that queuing gets. Right now it's pretty well metered in that it's an always stop, and so everyone kind of takes their turn. One of the unintended consequences could be queuing that isn't currently that bad on one of the approaches, could be worse. And it is one of those things I do agree that perhaps additional study, if the town is contemplating a traffic study, would need to be considered, because one of the big fears, and what happens a lot when you install a traffic signal, is that parking gets taken away, on-street parking gets impacted. And I'm sure in this community that would be a big problem and a big negative towards installing the traffic signal. I have not looked at how a signal would be laid out here and what would end up happening, but I just want you to be aware that is one of those other unintended potential consequences.
If you were going to do additional study, what exactly would you do? I'm trying to understand how would you study? What would you study?
Well, you would do an analysis with a traffic signal in, how with the current volumes, the current projections, how would that traffic signal operate? Where would the delays be? How would you time it? Where would those queues end up? Would you end up with an issue down at the train crossing? So would you have to give that approach more time?
Are there models that can do that?
Yes, definitely. And then the other thing would be to take a plan of the intersection and lay out how would you then lay out this intersection that you would have. And how far back would the queuing be? Would you need a turn lane somewhere? Really start to give it some thought, but that is obviously a little bit more of an in-depth level of study. But it's certainly before the town pursues moving forward with any sort of a traffic signal, because I think anything that would impact traffic obviously might generate an even bigger crowd and a more spirited discussion.
So you would recommend that the town or somebody do that additional study before making a decision?
Before making any decision on whether the traffic signal is contemplated. And again, that's regardless of this project. I mean, that's typically you would do, kind of a design study to take a look at how this traffic signal would work.
Okay. Anybody have, go ahead.
Actually, I have a question. I know you were counting cars, but did you count pedestrians as well?
We didn't count all the pedestrians, no.
As a person who crosses through East Milton every day with those signals, and with the, the changing sort of demographic and the changing of this Central Square area, I know the police chief has talked about this, but with the additional people that are in this project, is that intersection safe enough for pedestrians who are crossing to the various shops, going to the T, all that sort of thing? So
I can comment on that, and I do agree that if you were going to study this for any type of improvement, for anything in the future, that to include the pedestrian analysis, because again, if you're putting in a traffic signal and contemplating a pedestrian phase, obviously that will take time away from the operation, and you need to have a handle on how many pedestrians you're talking about in those times. As far as the pedestrian safety, the only thing to address that or to answer that question is the data that we have, and based on the crash data there is not currently a safety concern of any type, whether it's pedestrian or just vehicular. At that intersection is, as Jack said, surprisingly safe. It's very safe, maybe because there is congestion and people are driving slower. I mean, quite honestly, that ends up happening.
I see that.
So that might be, but yes, there is no, pedestrian deficiency kind of on the books as of right now. That says nothing that there couldn't be a tragedy tomorrow, but as of right now, there is no proven safety concern at that location.
thank you.
Mr. O'Brien, did you have questions?
I do, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jack, thank you for that dissertation on traffic studies and engineering.
I'm sorry.
Appreciate
At
that.
level.
I'm beginning to know more about this than I ever did, so maybe
very
next time if I stop at a streetlight or something, I'll, first of all, make sure I'll stop, thank you, Chief. Second thing I'll do is maybe I'll count the numbers, but I'm a simple guy, so let's just break it down. Suffice to say that you disagree with the opinion of the chief relative to traffic, parking, the need for signalization. Just disagree across the board?
I didn't want to get into that level. I just wanted to say that it's very, it does
The chief
not-
disagrees with
well,
you.
I like the guy. He doesn't know about
I'm not putting this on a personal level, I mean,
I just want to clarify one issue here, since I didn't,
Go ahead.
I didn't make a recommendation, if you note
I
in my
understand.
comments. There's no recommendations there. And I don't believe that I said, that this was absolutely, I said this had to be looked at. Much of what you just made as remarks are very true. What I'm saying is it warrants the analysis of it, if this is where you're gonna go. That's really what, there are no recommendations in my letter to you.
I understand.
It's just
But
issues.
can
So
I-
you
can I
agree- you
ask-
agree with Jennifer?
Can I ask you, when you put traffic signals in before, did you do the kind of study that Jennifer has just outlined? You know, the layout, the pedestrians, the more detailed study that.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, anytime you're looking at installing a traffic signal, I mean, that's typically the first thing you would do is you would run a.
And do you do that internally?
We do not do that internally. We typically hire traffic consultants. We have a small engineering staff, so we typically don't have the horsepower to do that type of analysis.
When, if I recall correctly, up the street, down by the telephone company building, we've got that notorious three-way intersection. Were traffic lights considered at that particular intersection?
It's prior to when I was chief, and I believe prior to when John was.
They were. In fact, and that, I had just basically started working for the town of Milton right around the time that intersection was being looked at as part of the Adams Street P-WED grant, Public Works Economic Development Grant. I recall at the time, and Kevin Mern was police chief at the time, but he had produced a letter from the state to the police chief, I believe, back in the 1940s, recommending that a traffic signal be looked at that location. So it just goes to show you, even back then, you know, it was a potential, you know, a potential candidate. But, you know, there was, my understanding is during the, you know, design hearings and public meetings for the Adams Street project, there was a lot of public opposition to a signal at that location. So it was ultimately dropped.
Would you anticipate public opposition to signalization at this particular intersection? I mean, what's the history of these signalization decisions?
As I've said, the one thing I've said to you is that as police chief, I don't have the expertise to say, oh, yeah, just put us, and I'm not trying to say that to, I mean,
I've
But what
worked
I'm
with them before, go ahead.
I'm trying to say that it warrants the analysis. If we're going to do this, because the opposite is if you approve it and you do it, and then you say to yourself,
You're gonna have
and
to-
all the, right, all the things that you've talked about, if suddenly the intersections, the pedestrian crossings, you have a higher rate of crash data, if you have a higher rate of pedestrian injuries, I just believe it's far more prudent to be proactive in this versus to sit back and all I've done is brought up two considerations for you. There are no recommendations there. These are just the issues that we see, that we felt need to be addressed.
Actually, Chief, I'm glad you're back at the table, because I have one extra question on the enforcement side of things.
You went through a stop sign?
No.
He's a rogue parker, though.
Yeah,
He's,
yeah.
Well, on parking, is Central Ave, that area, one of the hot spots for parking enforcement in the town?
On weekdays, in one area alone.
I leave the answer to the question.
I'll give you, so my answer, at night, very little. We've done a pretty good job regulating, because the one big thing at night now is steal and riot. Prior to steal and riot, it was not at all. Daytime, commuter daytime, is the big issue. And the issue in Milton is, we have 4, Milton, Central, Valley, Capen.
Yeah.
People trying to park for free all day. So if you notice on Central Avenue was regulated 2 hour from Adams Street all the way to Turner's Point. Because that's how far people violators will go. And every side street there, off of Elliott Street, has been regulated. So that's our big issue, absolutely. Parking, if people could park all day, be it from Wharf Street to Columbine Road, and then Curtis Road, they would do it. That's our big parking issue during the day.
Okay.
To answer the question, I want to be sure that I'm doing the best I can.
You are.
Let's put things in perspective right now, because I want to do that as we go through the next question. During the morning peak hour, this project will have 10 vehicles coming down the Elliott Street taking a left, 8 going straight and 5 going right onto Central Avenue. In the evening peak hour coming back, there'll be 13 coming over the bridge taking a right. There'll be 10 coming straight across Elliott, back up to the other side of Elliott to the garage, and there'll be 6 taking a left. So there's not an awful lot of influx due to this. But as far as the signal right now, I do know that it will move volumes a lot better. It probably won't move volumes faster. And I don't know, and I was like, again, I was so surprised that the crash history is down so low. I did watch it for 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours in the afternoon. People know they can't zip through there. They know they got a stop sign, number one, so they all stop before they go do anything else. I did see a couple of U-turns in the middle of the intersection. But other than that, people did go slow, and the pedestrians, they watch the cars and see if they're turning, and the cars watch the pedestrians. So now to get back to that question, do I need a signal? Right now, I don't think you do. Right now, I would say, if someone asked me tonight, yes or no, I'd have to say no tonight, based on what I've seen.
okay.
Excuse me, do you mean as it exists, or
Even
assuming
when
the
the pro-
project, even with the project?
Even with this project, because I just told you, like, 10 cars taking the left, that's 1 car every 6 minutes. That's not gonna cause the influx that's gonna create a crash history that's going to say that this could have been alleviated with the traffic signal. It's something to watch, don't get me wrong, but tonight, if I had the answer, I'd say no. Yes.
Could I ask one more question? Because you say you're not making a recommendation, Chief, but there's one sentence in here that you say in your letter, the installation of permanent signalization with electronic crossing indicators is critical. When I read that,
Yeah,
it
so
sounded
what
like
what I mean by that is, and as I've said right from the get-go, as
Okay.
police chief, I don't have the expertise to decide, is both Jack and John do
Okay.
decide. But I think the look, giving it the look and making
Okay.
a true determination is critical, because they say, I'm sure he has to be surprised, he just went and looked. I think if he just looked at his book and looked at it, his numbers he thought would be different. I don't think anyone here has even shown me a number, how many cars come over the Central Ave Bridge a day? I've not seen that, I looked, I haven't seen that number anywhere.
Yeah, it's in here. 6,000.
See, 6,000. I asked the question the other day, someone told me the other day, it's not even 3,000. I said, it has to be more than 3,000 cars.
You're
But I
right.
believe that number you took in June though, am I correct? Isn't that a June?
No, that one I
14?
just took in October.
Even,
And it compared favorably to the one I did back in 2011.
so,
Okay,
it's
thank
still
you.
out of count. So
I just
that,
wanted to-
that's my,
I just
when
wanted
I
to
say
clarify.
critical, I mean critical in that, the analysis of it, not the absolute determination. I'm gonna be very offensive, that's not my expertise, but I believe the analysis is correct.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
You done this time? You done?
Yes, you are.
Now if I could shift gears for 3 seconds on parking, I just wanted to remind the board, I did look at the parking again, and I looked at both the ITE, and then I think when we left here, you had asked me to take a look at the census tract data on the area. Well, I looked at 2 that I thought were representative of this type of building, which is an apartment, condo, well, whatever. And what I looked at was the Lower Mills section. You know, they have all those apartments down at the bottom of the hill on Adams Street. And then I also looked at, I'm familiar with Quincy, I looked at North Quincy Station and the apartments around there. And between the 2 of them, they averaged 1.19 vehicles per household. So, I mean, those are things that I looked at. It's not like I take a look at a whole lot of single-family homes. I looked at those types, every housing unit in those census tracts, and that's what that ended up being. I'm not trying to convince, I'm just letting you know that's how that came out and stuff like that. And I will tell you, you're right, if you do a sketch for this one with traffic signals and you have the stop bar pulled back for vehicles to make the turns, you can't start a car up in the middle of a traffic signal. In other words, if you're parked, you can't, all of a sudden, you get a green light or a red light or who's moving, you can't do that. You have to prohibit parking everywhere in between all of these stop lines. Now, you all know that that's gonna wipe out a whole lot of parking right in the middle of the liquor store and all of that, because those will all be right in the middle of the signalized intersection.
Well.
Yeah, as I was going through the various materials tonight and thinking about the prior meetings too, I think I've heard at least 2, maybe 3 different figures about how many parking spaces would be lost, on-street parking, as a result of the development.
Sure. Yeah, are whispering, because I wanted to get that answer for you, and they can confirm, but they tell me 1, that's what I recollected, that.
Just
Yeah,
one,
Right now,
okay.
there's no
Because
legal.
I've heard
there's
2,
no-
I've heard 4, I've heard doing.
It's one, there's no zoning legal space that you can put on that street. Right now, they just, bumped in the curb and they park along the existing edge of pavement. And I've been out there and you can count 8 cars, you can get about 8 cars because, and they have to stop where the curbing ends, where the former loading dock of the facility used to be. So the cars don't park in front of that because they need access, for the construction and all that, for the demo. So by shifting the road down, the access to the podium, and being able to utilize that space that was formerly where the dock entrances were, you can get 7 cars. Now, again, it's not, you can't call it a parking space from a zoning point of view, because it's not the 9 by 18, 20, whatever you need for a parallel car. But right now, they only have about 3 feet.
That's the parking spaces on the podium or
No,
the
no,
parking
no,
spaces?
on the
On
street.
Elliott Street.
Our
On
Podium
Elliott
is our
Street.
surface parking,
Okay.
slightly elevated.
Right.
So, yeah, so.
When they did the improvements to the intersection, they widened, they pulled out the radius on the intersection, but they pulled it back in to get to the existing curb line. Well, that's only 3 feet wide, but they park there anyway. So it's tough to make two-way, I'm sure, to make two-way traffic when those cars are parked there, but that's what they do, and they're allowed to do it. So we're just displacing that. Yeah, we don't have the length that we have today, but we can still get 7 cars with how they park today, instead of 8.
Okay, and one other question that I think goes back to maybe the first meeting, but I just want to ask for a refresher if I could. Loading and unloading. How is that accomplished at the building? Like if somebody's moving in or if somebody has a delivery to,
When we first submitted the project, we had the building closer to the town-owned parcel in the northeast corner. When we submitted revised drawings, we moved the building away from that property line, and we have access doors in, off of that alley, and we have another entrance right on Central. So, yeah, there is an alley there, and there are entrance doors into the core area of the building that's storage areas, trash areas, and there's plenty of area there for tenants to move belongings in and out of the building, rather than on Elliott Street. So loading and unloading, trash removal, other things are all through the alley or through the entrance on Central.
and how wide is the alley?
On our side, the narrowest is
5 feet.
5'6" at the narrowest point between the,
That's 5. The walkway is 5
from
feet.
the, there's also 2 doors there, one for storage and one for out of a fire stair.
So the vehicle would park on Central then, and?
Yes.
And then you'd have to,
Hand trucks
Okay.
or whatever.
That's pretty much what they do on Quincy now, a lot of the high-rise. Since there's no overnight parking around the street in that area, that comes in early in the morning before anybody else does.
6 feet wide.
And either that or they'll make arrangements with the town and they'll pay for the permit to put the truck out there. But it happens now.
okay.
So you have 71 parking spaces, is that right? And how do they get divvied up? I mean, do they get assigned to people in these apartments? How does it work?
Steve manages existing property, so Steve should answer.
Okay.
Each apartment would be assigned a space.
A number?
Yes.
Their particular space?
Their particular space. And then we'd like to have the podium parking as guest parking, along with the opportunity to use the few spaces, but they're not technically spaces, but along Elliott Street, time and again. Or underneath the building, there's 8 spaces that could be given as a second parking space to units if necessary. After that, again, our position is that this building, there's no overnight parking on the street. If you rent there, you're renting knowing where you can park and what you can do. So I don't see the street parking as an issue for us.
You confused me a little bit when you were counting the parking spaces. How many parking spaces are there total, maximum?
There's 71 total. There's 65 under the building.
Okay.
6 on the podium. So 57, 1 for each apartment. There's 8 excess spaces under the building, secured parking. That would be available for people who have a second vehicle. The first 8 who sign up, pay a fee, and you get your space. After that, the people who are renting there will be renting with 1 vehicle, because you can't park overnight in the town. That's what we have to work with. And our ratio is 1.23. As Jack has mentioned earlier, Lower Mills is, I believe, 1.1, and I think North Quincy is 1.19 or something like that. So we are in line with that type of use for parking.
Okay. Do you have any other town people that you wanted to present this evening?
We have John Kiernan from the Conservation Commission, and we also have John Thompson from the DPW, so.
Okay. Let's do it. They're here. It looks like Mr. Kiernan's coming forward
Yep.
here.
I have you.
Good evening. Thank you for allowing me to address you, and I'll be very brief. My name is John Kiernan. I live on Cabot Street in Milton. I'm chairman of the Conservation Commission. And just as a very brief aside, I'm also on the Master Planning Committee. We had a number of citizen forum gatherings, and one of the consistent comments that we heard from the citizens was that there should be better coordination among the town boards. And that's really why I'm here, to ask for your indulgence perhaps and to share information. The Conservation Commission has 3 applications before it. One is for demolition, which we are quite anxious to facilitate because it is a public safety hazard as it exists. So we're trying to move that along. We have 2 other applications before us that will overlap with what you're considering tonight. First one is a site development plan, and the second one is the actual project development. They've been separated. We have some concerns because we don't know whether or not we have a contaminated site or not. When the applications were first filed, and 3 of them have been filed, only 1 has been addressed. But when they were first filed, we didn't know that there was a phase 1 assessment done in 1998. And at that time, contamination was discovered. There is an RAO, which is a response action outcome. But in order to get that, they removed 284 cubic yards of contaminated fill and some 29,000 gallons of contaminated water, which had accumulated in the, we call it the swimming pool, which is basically the current foundation. The leak apparently came from the lower mechanical room, which you probably do have documentation there. Currently, there are 8 soil boring holes in that area. We don't know currently what exists down there. Outside in the current open space, there are 4 monitoring wells. To my knowledge, and I would invite any correction, but to my knowledge, those monitoring wells have not been tested in 17 years. We don't know what's down there. Back in 1998, there was a free product that was taken out of there. The problem is that, and somebody mentioned earlier tonight that we've got some serious concerns about water discharge. The sheet flow that's going to come off, actually during the demolition process, there was asbestos-containing material. We don't know what's left in there, but as part of the demo plan, there'll be basically a fire hose put onto the demolition site to dampen it. That water has to go somewhere. We don't know where it's going. We know there are 2 catch basins, and in the demo plan, they've very courteously said, well, we'll put filter fabrics over there. But that may not be sufficient to guard the river. We believe that those 2 catch basins dump directly into the river, but we don't know that. So we've asked to have some additional data in that area. There are obviously significant environmental concerns at the demolition stage. And one of the other problems is that we've seen you probably see it in your site plans, that there's a detention basin right at the corner of Elliott and Central Avenue, which is probably a good idea. The problem is, that's where the underground storage tanks are. That's where the monitoring wells are. We don't know what's down there. So what's happened is the demo plan has now removed the detention basin and put that off to a site plan development and/or the project development. That creates a great difficulty for us. We don't know what to do with the water, and we need to detain it somewhere to clean it before it goes into the river. So that we do have some overlapping concerns. And actually, one of the other ones, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but on March 9th, 2011, the Conservation Commission issued an enforcement order with a cease and desist order, that nothing was to be done on this site. Until there was a resolution of the violation. The violation was the removal of, 250, 275-year-old oak tree that went back to John Adams' days. That was of serious concern, and the order issued because we had the conservation agent on site and said, don't chop down that tree, and they cut it down. We had a commissioner on site who said, don't cut down that tree, and they cut it down. So we issued the enforcement order and said, no more work on this site. And the entire site is within the 200-foot Rivers Protection Act boundary. That's our jurisdiction. And we said, no more. Now, since then, and I give Steve credit, he's come to us on at least 2, I believe 3 occasions. Actually, one was in April there was a hole in the side, and I think there was a rodent problem. And we gave an exemption from our cease and desist order and said, go ahead and fix the side so you make it safe for the public. There was a second one, was just a landscaping issue that we did administratively, and allowed relief from the enforcement order. And I believe there was a third one to fix a roof area. I know it's now fully collapsed, but at one time there was an effort to shore it up, again, for public safety. But that enforcement order still exists. So we need to coordinate, and that enforcement order shouldn't stop the project. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that we need to coordinate our efforts in order to make sure that you don't approve a plan that we can't approve. For instance, we've already addressed this at a public session, and one of the concerns we have is maintaining open space that we currently have. And the initial reaction was, well, you can use the town's land for open space. That doesn't work with us. I mean, the project itself has to stand or fall on its own merits. And we need to preserve the current open space, which is actually at the corner of Elliott and Central Avenue. That's where we need to have replicated the loss of a 250-year-old tree. You can't put, it wouldn't fit. Now, obviously, we're not going to ask them for a 250-year-old tree, but there's going to be something that is of significant, a substantive tree. And to do that in the area where it was cut down over our specific objection, we need open space. And if you approve a plan that takes away our open space, then we're going to be at odds, and it's not going to help the developer. So what I'm suggesting is, and I'm suggesting that we have a joint meeting. And I don't want to slow you down because we have different mandates, we have different interests that we protect, but there is an overlap. And at some point, we should exchange information and perhaps have a joint meeting so that we're not at odds if we want to move this project along. So I would ask you to consider whether or not before making a decision, in accordance with the open meeting law, we have a joint meeting just so that we can tell you what our concerns are. But again, to assure the developer, we are very concerned that we try to move along in an expeditious fashion, the demolition component of it, but we don't want to make it worse. So I just ask you to consider it sometime in the future. I don't know what your schedule is, but at a minimum, we need to exchange agendas. So we know what you're doing and you know what we're doing.
Mr. Cannon, wouldn't the complete answer to this conundrum be for us to simply, let's assume we were to approve this project, and I honestly don't know how I feel about it right now. We're not traffic experts, and we're having people come in and give us disparate views, and it's not easy for us to resolve that. But if let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we approved it with a number of conditions, and in our conditions we said, obviously, since it's a state permit that you're dealing with, it's not a local permit that we're dealing with. What if we said we approve it, but it's subject to you getting all the necessary approvals from the Town Conservation Commission? Doesn't that take care of the problem?
It does, but it may make it more difficult, and I don't want it to be functionally prohibitive for the developer. If we were to do it together, for instance, the area that we're seeking to preserve as open space is currently filled with a building. If there were some mechanism that would fit with the developer's desires, and I understand there's a return on investment that they have to consider, but if there's some way to do that now, it should be done up front. Because if you approved a plan that came to us that was contrary to our state mandate, I'm not talking about the town bylaw, state mandate to preserve open space and to ensure that there's no deleterious impact to the environment. The river's so close. I mean, it's a real issue for us. But I'm concerned that if you approved one in your discretion, and unknowingly it was in contradiction to one of our interests that we seek to protect, that would be inefficient. Because we might then approve something environmentally and then have to send it back to you folks. And I think that's probably unnecessary. And I'm not suggesting that our interests are the same, but I believe that there is a significant overlap. And I just don't want to make it sort of a fait accompli that we're stuck with, and then we may be able to find a simple solution to our concerns that would then undermine the decision that you've already made. So perhaps all you need to do is hear our concerns. And I've got the cart almost before the horse here because we have 3 filings. but only one of them has been addressed at public session, and that's the demolition plan. But the demolition plan, it's like a snowball going downhill. It creates issues at the next stage. Right now, our concern is we don't want the demolition to make the contamination worse, or the potential contamination. We don't know what's down there. We understand there's a 21E that was done, 21E report that was done in 2002. We haven't seen it. We understand, this is a violation of our enforcement order, but in June of this year, there was remediation done, the asbestos-containing material was removed from the building. That's work in the building. But it's a good idea to get the asbestos material out of there, and we do have the manifest to show that they're properly disposed of. There were 20,000 gallons of contaminated water. We don't know where it went. We don't have any proof that it was sent to a licensed site facility. I presume it was, but, and I'm not putting form over the substance, but we need some assurance that the remediation was done correctly. We also need an assurance that the demolition, the site plan, and the project development will not worsen the existing or the potential existing contamination. It was certainly contaminated in 1998. There is an RAO, which is essentially an approval that, okay, as it exists, you can move forward. You don't have to do anything else right now. But we've got 17 years of 4 monitoring wells that have not been tested. We need to know what's down there. And I think you need to know that as well, so that we can coordinate our effort to, if the project is destined to succeed on its merits, then so be it. But let's work together. And if we can fix it in some fashion, then we should do that as sort of a joint effort.
Here's the problem. We have 180 days. We have 6 months to close the public hearing. We're 4 months into it right now. And so unless the developer agrees to this approach, then I don't think we could do it. Because you're not going to be done in January with all the stuff you've just outlined. I mean, just to test the stuff, it's going to take you longer than that. So I asked the developer, what do you think of the idea of our sort of,
Well, first, let me say sincerely, very well-spoken and thoughtful, and I take as sincere and in good faith what you said, and I recognize your jurisdiction, and I respect where you're coming from, so I sincerely don't have a problem with how you've stated your concerns. The idea of a joint hearing is not crazy, not often, but sometimes on a 40B that has happened. I'd really have to wait to the conclusion of this hearing to see where you all think you're at in terms of next hearing and status, so that I'd really, I think, have to talk to my client afterwards and see whether we might agree to an extension.
Sure.
But I think there's a middle ground. And I say this with a question coupled to it. I know that hearings are ongoing, scheduled the next one in, I think, November 18th or whenever it is.
Correct.
I mean, I think that information in terms of, again, respecting what you said about wanting to share further information, you've shared a lot tonight, but I think that as they go through their hearings in November and probably another hearing, that information can be forthcoming to be conveyed to this board, if not later in November, but in the meeting in December. And again, if we need a meeting in January, that there still could be more information. And then I couple that to what the chairman said. We certainly understand and respect that absolutely there would be a condition that, we, before breaking ground on our project, other than the demolition, which is separate, would have to get all proper approvals under the State Wetlands Act. We know that, and I appreciate again the chairman of the Conservation Commission saying that my client has been working with them over the last few months on that, and so that's my thought. I'm not sure that we can't achieve both objectives, closing the hearing within 6 months or very soon thereafter. So I'm not saying no to an extension, but still achieve what you want. That's what I think makes sense.
I mean, it is possible to put conditions in the permit that you folks issue that kind of triggers, they can't get certain building permits and all that sort of thing from the building inspector until they've addressed the issues for the Conservation Commission.
that's what I had in mind to do.
And that's
So-
standard. I mean,
Yeah.
we do see that from the planning board and occasionally from you folks. That's the way it usually works. We understand that. The difficulty is, I can see, and I can't speak for the commission, we haven't taken a vote, but in public session, there's been some concern about the way the building is currently designed. removes the public space that we seek to, A, maintain, and B, we need an area to replicate that which we lost. And that is a valid enforcement order that, prevents going forward until it's resolved. And we're not throwing it up as a roadblock, we're throwing it up as a challenge to come up with a good response and a good replication.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
John, just for my edification, perhaps the edification of some of the folks who are watching at home, just a very simple question. Why do we need to replicate the tree? Why do we need to replicate that which was lost? Just lay out the Conservation Commission's thinking on that particular,
Well, under the...
and its duties.
Right, under the Wetlands Protection Act, any alteration requires a permission. It sometimes happens that people do things without permission. This was one in, it was in contradistinction to our order, don't cut the tree down. And so that doesn't change our performance standard. The performance standard is if you remove a tree from the resource area, then it's a 3-to-1 replication order that we've been uniform with for the last, well, I've been on the commission for 22 years, and we've been consistent with that performance standard. It's a 3-to-1 standard. Now, we can't find 3 250-year-old trees. I get that. But there's some kind of an accommodation that a major substantial tree could be put in that same area. It currently operates as open space. I understand that part of it has macadam on it. There are actually underground tanks in that same area. But it's still an open area, and I thought some of the original plans were that would be a great place for people to meet. I know there's been a lot of discussion at the Milton Master Planning Committee about finding areas where, people in these districts can meet and discuss and have a cup of coffee or read a book or something. It's not a bad idea, and I think it would probably be an amenity that the folks that live there would appreciate. And we believe that open space should be preserved. That's actually one of the interests that's protected by the state act. And that's our mandate, is to ensure that the interests are protected. So it's a legitimate interest, and the performance standard is 3-to-1. And for the 22 years that I've been doing it, we've been consistent in imposing that response. If something is removed, you have to replace it 3 times. It doesn't always fit in that area. And sometimes, and we've discussed that with the developer, sometimes you can plant the tree somewhere else. We just took one down at the library, a beautiful old copper beech tree. And that's an opportunity for somebody else to replace a major tree. And that was discussed at one of our meetings, that the 3 trees don't necessarily have to go at the corner of Central and Elliott. We can be flexible in that, and it's for the benefit of the town.
Just for my own, so you've got the demo permit, the demo
Before us.
process before us, not heard yet? Scheduled to be?
We've started it, it's been continued a number of times, we're still missing data, and like the 21E, we don't have. That was, I guess, produced in 2002, but we haven't seen it. We don't know where the water went, and we don't have a response plan that's satisfactory to us as to where's the water going to go during the demolition. That's going to be contaminated, because as the building comes down, there is a lot of construction debris. The water is used to dampen the dust, and that's an appropriate mechanism, but it's got to go somewhere. There's no place to hold it. At one time, we thought that the detention basin would be the appropriate place to hold it to make sure it's clean before it's discharged, especially to the river. The difficulty is that if they do the detention basin now, they have to remove the tanks. And they don't know what's down there either. To my knowledge, nobody knows what's underneath there. It may be clean, it may be contaminated. And as I understand it, when the property was purchased from Mrs. O'Neill back in the day, that there's an indemnification obligation on the part of the current owners to assume the risk of cleaning the property. And that means something to us. We want the property clean. And that is a state mandate.
Is there contemplated schedule for any other activities that the commission has to engage in, the site development and the project development plan, I think is what you called it?
Right. We initially anticipated 2 proposals, one for the demolition and one for the project. But it's now in 3 sections. So it's now demolition site plan, And there is some concern that we have as to, there's a little bit of confusion in our plans, because it says that it's basically gonna be at grade, and any void will be filled. Both the demo proposal and the engineering plans themselves show that. But if you fill what we call the swimming pool, if you fill it, where does the water go? And even if you let the water accumulate in that area to hold it, the problem is, that's where the leak is that they discovered back in 1998. One side of it, next to the the lower mechanical room, there are cracks in the foundation. And the problem with that is that if you put 20,000 gallons on top of it, that is huge pressure. And the recharge is being forced down where we believe there's contaminated soil. That's pushing, and it's pushing the contamination somewhere. We don't know where it's going. Is it going towards the river? We certainly hope not. But we need to know that. And it's not a tremendous proposition, and I don't think it's a huge expense. They may disagree, but to find out what's down there, the monitoring wells are already there. All you have to do is test what's down at the water level. On the soil boring side of it, they probably have to rebore those. I don't know, but there are borings in place currently. So we need to know what's there, because that affects our analysis of what happens when you put 20,000 gallons into a box. That's a significant issue for us. So those are some of the issues that we're trying to work out right now, and they're not insurmountable. But we need to get them done. That's a different issue, though, than the actual project plan. That may have other aspects. And by the way, we're very interested in the number of cars there, because cars have petroleum droppings, and that has to go somewhere. And we're very concerned that it go to a place that it can be cleaned and not discharged into the river. Right now, it looks like there's a pipe that goes to the river. In fact, it looks like there are two, but we're not sure. So whatever you put into the drain hole goes into the Neponset. And that's a big mandate for us, that, we're chartered with protecting the river. All right.
Can I ask a clarification question? So in terms of us possibly approving a plan that would be inconsistent with what you would be able to approve, does that relate solely to open space, or does it also relate to the environmental issue? I mean, you related it to the fact that, you need to have the open space to replace where the tree was, and a certain amount of open space. I mean, is that the one issue that, or are there other issues that?
That's a significant issue, but it's not the only interest that we protect. And I just mentioned cars. That's very important. I mean, we need to take a look at, if there's underground parking for 65 cars, we want to know whether there's going to be a drain there. And we want to make sure that there's some kind of oil separator and cleaning protocol to make sure that what washes down, and there's an incredible amount of oil that comes off of cars.
Mm-hmm.
And you start, you're adding up the cars, it's an exponential explosion in the amount of contamination that comes from there. So that's an area of environmental concern. But that's not insurmountable either.
I think the way I would like to proceed would be to welcome and invite Conservation Commission to come to any further hearings that we have, to give us an update. And I'm gonna leave it to the developer to decide how they wanna proceed. I mean, they're the ones that are at risk, not at us. If the developer says before the 6 months are up, I don't wanna bother going through with this until I see how Concom comes out, well, I think that's your decision. It sounds like they have some issues with you guys, but it's their risk that they run if they force us to go forward, which they have a right to do. And only to be turned down by you. I mean, you could say a pox on you, Board of Appeals. We're going to do what we're going to do, but that's the risk that they run. So I don't think I see any great advantage to having joint meetings, but I certainly want to be kept informed.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, if I may. We certainly agree, and as I said already, we'll talk, our whole team, afterward. I don't think the information is per se a surprise to the engineers and my client. I haven't gone to the Conservation Commission hearings, and I'm not an engineer, so I hadn't been as privy to some of the details. But number one, certainly, I don't think it's a surprise. Number two, absolutely, we know we have to comply with things. And the third point, as you just said, it is our risk. But in no way do I mean that, as, in your face, we insist on the 6 months. We may not, but even if we do, it's not in your face, it's just some practical questions and how far we get with you folks over the next couple of months, sincerely. So, because I appreciate the way this hearing has been conducted and the way you have spoken, appropriate to set forth what you have and all of that. So that's where we're at, and I appreciate that. I mean, right now, I would say, as I said earlier, let's see where we are at the end of tonight, schedule another hearing, and my team hobnob afterwards, and report to you before next hearing, if we can, what we think we'd like to do. The only other thing I would say is, Chris, do you have anything you want to add on the question of the 21E or the Concom process?
No, we have copies, and I could distribute it. We have the RAO that Rizzo had done back in '98, and, it outlines pretty clearly that the site has been cleaned. They did, soil samples, groundwater samples, and found that there was no potential for contamination, except for, it was an A2, which means it was infeasible to get whatever was remaining below the boiler room. But we can get that all to the commission and go through all that. But I have it here, and and the site has been, the activity and use limitation is none. It's been determined, and again in 2000. So we have that data if we want to pass it out, but I think it's more for the commission. We can go through that. But
With due respect, the Rizzo report, which I've read, is 1997. It can only be relied on by the client, which was HP Hood. And at the time, it was an industrial use. And as everyone in this room knows, regulations for DEP have changed considerably. As even of Monday, there were new regulations that we're hearing about at the REBA Bar Association meeting. So the 1997 report, I understand that at time that particular spill was taken care of, but the reports also recommended that the tanks be removed, and they weren't. So, as the chairman has pointed out, no one knows what's going on with that site. What has happened to those tanks since 1997, one can only imagine.
Which
but-
tank? The one out, the exterior tank?
The underground
But-
tanks,
Underground.
under the
Kathleen,
slab.
that's
So,
all
you're just gonna
interesting.
make it as part of your conditions to
That
the,
was fully what I expected to do.
yeah, and so,
It's not,
and they're gonna have to do it for their financing,
it's not in our
so-
jurisdiction.
Yeah,
It's not our
Again,
jurisdiction.
I mean, I agree.
Yeah.
I think we're all in agreement. They have some hurdles to meet, and those are important issues, but they're under a different set of
Yep.
values and whatnot than we deal with. And so I'm delighted, John, that you came tonight, and I hope you'll keep us informed, and we'll do this jointly and figure out what you want to do. I mean, I'm not thrilled about the idea of writing some long decision. If you say to me, no, Brian, you don't have to do that because you can wait, because I gotta see what John's body is gonna do first. I mean, believe me, I'm delighted to have that be the outcome, so.
Yeah, and as you said,
I will join you in that.
you've been on both sides of it as developers counsel, and so I hope you understand the sincerity of what I'm saying. We may decide that it's appropriate to give a little more time to see what happens, or they may decide
That's fine.
to
We don't
take the
need,
risk.
but we don't need to decide that
Exactly,
tonight.
yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. I'd like to finish with whoever else is from the town.
Thank
so
you
that
very
they don't, thank you, John.
Thank you.
So that they don't have to come back unless they want to come back.
that would be the
Certainly, certainly welcome to come back, but you may not choose to.
Yes, my name is John Thompson, I'm the town engineer, and I guess I'm here tonight representing both the DPW and the engineering department. Joe Lynch, the DPW director, did, submit a letter with a lot of detailed comments, and my goal tonight was just sort of touch on some of sort of the major issues that we saw coming down the pipeline.
I'll take another one. I got one,
And
but I gave it to my
and to
engineer.
be
Thank
honest,
you.
most of the issues with parking and traffic that, we sort of, we're looking at have sort of already been talked about quite a bit tonight, so there is a major a major concern that we have with the stormwater analysis, though, that I do want to talk about. As submitted by the applicant, the stormwater analysis is largely based on the assumption that all of the stormwater runoff from the site is currently discharging to the town's municipal drainage system, which, you know, from some brief observation, I would disagree with. You know, I've made some observations on the site of some downspouts on the northwest corner of the building that appear to be, you know, discharging roof runoff sort of to the rear of the property, which ultimately might, you know, flow overland towards the river across the tracks. I've also observed some what appear to be active infiltration chambers on the town-owned property underneath the, you know, in the parking area, which appear to be, you know, plumbed to accept some of the roof runoff. You know, how big the portions of the roof, you know, these areas are actually draining, you know, there's no way of knowing. We unfortunately don't have any records showing any sort of, you know, drainage patterns or drainage connections in that area. But really, the only hard connection to the municipal system that I was able to sort of verify was a pipe that's a small diameter pipe that's visible, you know, from a manhole structure near, that's located near the existing loading dock, the bays. You know, and honestly, looking at it, to me, you know, and sort of looking at it by eye where the, you know, where the pipe is going, to me, it looks like it's a drainage